Imagine a world where a single city rises from nothing to command 3 continents, rule over 70 million people, and shape the laws, languages, and culture we still live by today. This was no ordinary empire. It was Rome. But how did it climb to such impossible heights? And why did it come crashing down in flames? Stay with me, because the story of the Roman Empire is one of ambition, betrayal, bloodshed, and brilliance. And I promise, once you enter Rome's world, you'll never see history the same way again. The rise and fall of the Roman Empire. From a legend of wolf-raised brothers to the greatest empire the world had ever seen, Rome ruled with iron, fire, and brilliance. But power is never eternal. This is the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire. What do gladiator games, aqueducts, and a single calendar date we still use today all have in common? They come from an empire that began as a tiny village on the Tiber River, an empire that would conquer 3 continents, only to collapse under its own weight. The Roman Empire's story isn't just history, it's a warning. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it sure didn't fall in one either. This empire went from a scrappy backwater town to the powerhouse that gave us gladiators, concrete, and even pizza's ancestors. But then, boom, barbarians at the gates, betrayal, collapse. So, what really happened to Rome? Let's break it down. What if I told you? A single city, born from a legend of wolf-raised brothers, would go on to rule over 70 million people, dominate 3 continents, and shape the very world we live in today. This is the story of the Roman Empire, its astonishing rise, and its dramatic fall. The origins. Rome's tale begins not with marble palaces, but with mud huts along the Tiber River in the 8th century BC. Legend speaks of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers abandoned, saved by a she-wolf. Romulus, after a bloody quarrel, kills his brother and founds the city of Rome. But the truth, Rome was just one of many small settlements in central Italy, until ambition set it apart. Republic rising. In 509 BC, Rome overthrew its kings and birthed a republic. Power shifted to elected officials and senators, though only the elite truly held sway. Through grit, cunning diplomacy, and brutal wars, Rome conquered its neighbors, mastered Italy, and clashed with the mighty Carthage in the Punic Wars. From these wars emerged heroes like Scipio Africanus, and Rome's first taste of global dominance. From republic to empire. But power breeds ambition. Generals like Julius Caesar grew too powerful for the Senate to control. Caesar's conquest of Gaul made him a legend, and his march on Rome shattered the republic. "Dictator for life!" they proclaimed, until daggers struck him down on the Ides of March. Yet the republic was already doomed. Civil wars tore Rome apart until Caesar's heir, Octavian, later Augustus, emerged victorious. Rome had an emperor. The republic was no more. The Pax Romana. Augustus ushered in the Pax Romana, 200 years of relative peace. Rome's legions built roads stretching 250,000 miles. Aqueducts carried water across the empire. Colosseums hosted games that still captivate our imagination. From Britain to Egypt, Spain to Mesopotamia, Rome ruled an empire of breathtaking scale and diversity. Cracks in the empire. But even the mightiest empires are fragile. Political chaos, economic troubles, and endless wars strained Rome. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. In the 3rd century, the empire nearly collapsed, only to be rescued by leaders like Diocletian and Constantine, who even made Christianity Rome's official faith. Still, the empire was too vast, too divided. Constantine moved the capital east to Byzantium, later Constantinople, leaving the old city vulnerable. The fall of Rome. By the 5th century, Rome was a shadow of itself. Barbarian tribes, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, pressed at its borders. In 410 AD, Rome was sacked. And in 476 AD, the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was overthrown. The Western Roman Empire had fallen. But in the East, the Byzantine Empire endured, carrying Rome's legacy for another 1,000 years. Rome may have fallen, but its shadow still looms large. Our laws, languages, architecture, and even our calendars carry its mark. The Roman Empire never truly died. It lives on in us. Want more epic history? Subscribe for the untold stories of empires, battles, and legends. Did you know that the Roman Empire is actually 600 years older than the Great Wall of China? Yeah, it's true. Most people think that the Roman Empire was this big, sprawling empire that just kind of fell apart after Rome was sacked in 410 AD. But that's not really true. I mean, yeah, Rome was sacked and burned to the ground in 410 AD by the Visigoths, but that wasn't the end of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire continued on for another 500 years after that. In fact, the Roman Empire lasted for a total of 2,700 years, making it the longest-lasting civilization in world history. The Roman Empire was founded in 27 BC by Augustus Caesar, and it officially ended in 1453 AD, with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. Yeah, that's how long the Roman Empire lasted. It makes you wonder what would have happened if the Goths had not sacked Rome in 410. Would the empire have lasted even longer? Who knows? But what's really amazing is that the Romans were able to keep their civilization going for so long, even though they didn't have the technology or the infrastructure that we have today. I mean, just think about it. No roads, no bridges, no cars, no planes, no internet, and yet they managed to hold on to their empire for over 2,700 years. That's pretty impressive. The history of the Roman Empire. The Roman people was the ethnicity and the body of Roman citizens. Latin, Roman, Ancient Greek, Romei, Romeoi, during the Roman Kingdom, the Roman Republic, and the Roman Empire. This concept underwent considerable changes throughout the long history of the Roman civilization as its borders expanded and contracted. Originally only including the Latins of Rome itself, Roman citizenship was extended to the rest of the Italic peoples by the 1st century BC and to nearly every subject of the Roman Empire in late antiquity. At their peak, the Romans ruled large parts of Europe, the Near East, and North Africa through conquests made during the Roman Republic and the subsequent Roman Empire. Although defined primarily as a citizenship, Romanness has also and variously been described as a cultural identity, a nationality, or a multi-ethnicity that eventually encompassed a vast regional diversity. Citizenship grants, demographic growth, and settler and military colonies rapidly increased the number of Roman citizens. The increase reached its peak with Emperor Caracalla's AD 212 Antonine Constitution, which extended citizenship rights to all free inhabitants of the empire. Roman identity provided a larger sense of common identity and became important when distinguishing from non-Romans, such as barbarian settlers and invaders. Roman culture was far from homogeneous. Though there was a common cultural idiom, one of the strengths of the Roman Empire was also its ability to incorporate traditions from other cultures, notably but not exclusively Greece. Border changes of the Roman state from 6th century BC to 15th century AD. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century ended the political domination of the Roman Empire in Western Europe, but Roman identity survived in the West as an important political resource. Through the failures of the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, of reconquering and keeping control of the West, and suppression from the new Germanic kingdoms, Roman identity faded away in the West, more or less disappearing in the 8th and 9th centuries. In the Greek-speaking East, still under imperial control, Roman identity survived until the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 and beyond. Whereas Roman identity faded away in most of the lands where it was once prominent, for some regions and peoples it proved considerably more tenacious. In Italy, Romans, Romani in Latin and Italian, has continuously and uninterruptedly been the demonym of the citizens of Rome from the foundation of the city to the present day. During the Eastern Roman Empire, and for some time after its fall, Greeks identified as Romeoi, or related names. In Switzerland, several names are Roman references, the Romans and the Romansch people. Several names derive from the Latin Romani, such as the Romanians, Aromanians, and Istro-Romanians, or from the Germanic Walhaz, a term originally referring to the Romans, adopted in the form Vlach as the self-designation of the Megleno-Romanians. The Roman Empire ruled the Mediterranean and much of Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. The Romans conquered most of this during the Republic, and it was ruled by emperors following Octavian's assumption of effective sole rule in 27 BC. The Western Empire collapsed in 476 AD, but the Eastern Empire lasted until the fall of Constantinople in 1453. By 100 BC, the city of Rome had expanded its rule from the Italian peninsula to most of the Mediterranean and beyond. However, it was severely destabilized by civil wars and political conflicts, which culminated in the victory of Octavian over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and the subsequent conquest of the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. In 27 BC, the Roman Senate granted Octavian overarching military power, imperium, and the new title of Augustus, marking his accession as the first Roman emperor. The vast Roman territories were organized into senatorial provinces, governed by proconsuls who were appointed by lot annually, and imperial provinces, which belonged to the emperor but were governed by legates. The first 2 centuries of the empire saw a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity, known as the Pax Romana, Roman peace. Rome reached its greatest territorial extent under Trajan, R. 98-117 AD. But a period of increasing trouble and decline began under Commodus. In the 3rd century, the empire underwent a 49-year crisis that threatened its existence due to civil war, plagues, and barbarian invasions. The Gallic and Palmyrene empires broke away from the state, and a series of short-lived emperors led the empire, which was later reunified under Aurelian. The civil wars ended with the victory of Diocletian, who set up 2 different imperial courts in the Greek East and Latin West. Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, moved the imperial seat from Rome to Byzantium in 330 and renamed it Constantinople. The migration period, involving large invasions by Germanic peoples and by the Huns of Attila, led to the decline of the Western Roman Empire. With the fall of Ravenna to the Germanic Herulians and the deposition of Romulus Augustus in 476 by Odoacer, the Western Empire finally collapsed. The Byzantine, Eastern Roman Empire survived for another millennium with Constantinople as its sole capital until the city's fall in 1453. Due to the empire's extent and endurance, its institutions and culture had a lasting influence on the development of language, religion, art, architecture, literature, philosophy, law, and forms of government across its territories. Latin evolved into the Romance languages, while medieval Greek became the language of the East. The empire's adoption of Christianity resulted in the formation of medieval Christendom. Roman and Greek art had a profound impact on the Italian Renaissance. Rome's architectural tradition served as the basis for Romanesque, Renaissance, and neoclassical architecture, influencing Islamic architecture. The rediscovery of classical science and technology, which formed the basis for Islamic science, in medieval Europe contributed to the scientific Renaissance and scientific revolution. Many modern legal systems, such as the Napoleonic Code, descend from Roman law. Rome's republican institutions have influenced the Italian city-state republics of the medieval period, the early United States, and modern democratic republics. In modern historiography, the Western Roman Empire was the western provinces of the Roman Empire, collectively, during any period in which they were administered separately from the eastern provinces by a separate, independent imperial court. Particularly during the period from AD 395 to 476, there were separate, co-equal courts dividing the governance of the empire into the western provinces and the eastern provinces, with a distinct imperial succession in the separate courts. The terms Western Roman Empire and Eastern Roman Empire were coined in modern times to describe political entities that were de facto independent. Contemporary Romans did not consider the empire to have been split into 2 empires, but viewed it as a single polity governed by 2 imperial courts for administrative expediency. The Western Empire collapsed in 476, and the Western Imperial Court in Ravenna disappeared by 554 at the end of Justinian's Gothic War. Though there were periods with more than one emperor ruling jointly before, the view that it was impossible for a single emperor to govern the entire empire was institutionalized by Emperor Diocletian following the disastrous civil wars and disintegrations of the crisis of the 3rd century. He introduced the system of the Tetrarchy in 286, with 2 senior emperors titled Augustus, one in the east and one in the west, each with an appointed subordinate, and heir titled Caesar. Though the tetrarchic system would collapse in a matter of years, the East-West administrative division would endure in one form or another over the coming centuries. As such, the unofficial Western Roman Empire would exist intermittently in several periods between the 3rd and 5th centuries. Some emperors, such as Constantine I and Theodosius I, governed, if briefly, as the sole Augustus across the Roman Empire. On the death of Theodosius in 395, the empire was divided between his 2 infant sons, with Honorius as his successor in the west, governing briefly from Mediolanum then from Ravenna, and Arcadius as his successor in the east, governing from Constantinople. In 476, after the Battle of Ravenna, the Roman army in the west suffered defeat at the hands of Odoacer and his Germanic foederati. Odoacer forced the abdication of the emperor Romulus Augustulus and became the first king of Italy. In 480, following the assassination of the previous Western emperor Julius Nepos, the Eastern emperor Zeno dissolved the Western court and proclaimed himself the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. The date of 476 was popularized by the 18th century British historian Edward Gibbon as a demarcating event for the fall of the Western Roman Empire and is sometimes used to mark the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages. Odoacer's Italy and other barbarian kingdoms, many of them representing former Western Roman allies that had been granted lands in return for military assistance, would maintain a pretense of Roman continuity through the continued use of the old Roman administrative systems and nominal subservience to the Eastern Roman court. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian I reimposed direct imperial rule on large parts of the former Western Roman Empire, including the prosperous regions of North Africa, the ancient Roman heartland of Italy, and parts of Hispania. Political instability in the eastern heartlands, combined with foreign invasions, plague, and religious differences, made efforts to retain control of these territories difficult, and they were gradually lost for good. Though the Eastern Empire retained territories in the south of Italy until the 11th century, the influence that the empire had over Western Europe had diminished significantly. The papal coronation of the Frankish king Charlemagne as Roman emperor in 800 marked a new imperial line that would evolve into the Holy Roman Empire, which presented a revival of the imperial title in Western Europe, but was in no meaningful sense an extension of Roman traditions or institutions. The Great Schism of 1054 between the churches of Rome and Constantinople further diminished any authority the emperor in Constantinople could hope to exert in the West. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, was the continuation of the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople during late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Having survived the events that caused the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, it endured until the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453. The term Byzantine Empire was coined only after its demise. Its citizens used the term Roman Empire and called themselves Romans. During the early centuries of the Roman Empire, the western provinces were Latinized, but the eastern parts kept their Hellenistic culture. Constantine I, 324-337, legalized Christianity and moved the capital to Constantinople. Theodosius, R. 379-395, made Christianity the state religion, and Greek gradually replaced Latin for official use. The empire adopted a defensive strategy and, throughout its remaining history, experienced recurring cycles of decline and recovery. Transition from republic to empire. Rome had begun expanding shortly after the founding of the Roman Republic in the 6th century BC, though not outside the Italian peninsula until the 3rd century BC. Thus it was an empire, a great power, long before it had an emperor. The Republic was not a nation-state in the modern sense, but a network of self-ruled towns, with varying degrees of independence from the Senate and provinces administered by military commanders. It was governed by annually elected magistrates, Roman consuls above all, in conjunction with the Senate. The 1st century BC was a time of political and military upheaval, which ultimately led to rule by emperors. The consul's military power rested in the Roman legal concept of imperium, meaning command, typically in a military sense. Occasionally, successful consuls or generals were given the honorary title imperator, commander. This is the origin of the word emperor, since this title was always bestowed to the early emperors. Rome suffered a long series of internal conflicts, conspiracies, and civil wars from the late 2nd century BC, while greatly extending its power beyond Italy. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar was briefly a perpetual dictator before being assassinated by a faction that opposed his concentration of power. This faction was driven from Rome and defeated at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC by Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted son Octavian. Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between them, but this did not last long. Octavian's forces defeated those of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. In 27 BC, the Senate gave him the title Augustus, venerated, and made him princeps, foremost, with proconsular imperium, thus beginning the Principate, the first epoch of Roman imperial history. Although the Republic stood in name, Augustus had all meaningful authority. During his 40-year rule, a new constitutional order emerged, so that upon his death, Tiberius would succeed him as the new de facto monarch. The Roman Empire is one of the most well-known empires in history, but how did it start? It started small, like really small. Rome was just a small Italian city-state in the 700s BC, but over the next few centuries, it grew into a massive empire that controlled almost all of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The empire was ruled by emperors like Augustus, Nero, and Caligula, and they ruled for over 200 years. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was a period of stability and prosperity in the empire's early years, but it was also a time of great inequality. As the empire grew, so did its army, and by the 3rd century AD, the Roman army was the largest and most powerful in the world. But the good times didn't last. By the 4th century, the empire was in decline. The economy was unstable, inflation was high, and the army was too big to be effective. In the 5th century, Rome was sacked by barbarians, and the Western Roman Empire fell. But the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years. Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, Latin for Roman peace, IPA, Pax Romana, is a roughly 200-year-long period of ancient Rome that is identified as a golden age of increased and sustained Roman imperialism, prosperous stability, hegemonic power, regional expansion, and relative peace and order, although it still featured a number of internal revolts and external wars, including the Roman-Persian Wars. Traditionally, the onset is understood to be the ascent of Augustus, who also founded the Roman Principate in 27 BCE. Conversely, the end of the era is considered as 180 CE, with the death of Marcus Aurelius, the last of the 5 good emperors. It was as part of this period that the Roman Empire achieved its greatest territorial extent under Trajan in 117 CE. Additionally, the Roman Empire's population is estimated to have peaked at 70 million people during the Pax Romana, accounting for 33% of the world's population. Following the Pax Romana, and according to Cassius Dio, the dictatorial reign of Commodus, later followed by the Year of the 5 Emperors and the crisis of the 3rd century, marked Rome's descent from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. The 200 years that began with Augustus's rule is traditionally regarded as the Pax Romana, Roman peace. The cohesion of the empire was furthered by a degree of social stability and economic prosperity that Rome had never before experienced. Uprisings in the provinces were infrequent and put down mercilessly and swiftly. The success of Augustus in establishing principles of dynastic succession was limited by his outliving a number of talented potential heirs. The Julio-Claudian dynasty lasted for 4 more emperors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, before it yielded in 69 AD to the strife-torn Year of the 4 Emperors, from which Vespasian emerged as the victor. Vespasian became the founder of the brief Flavian dynasty, followed by the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, which produced the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Transition from classical to late antiquity. In the view of contemporary Greek historian Cassius Dio, the accession of Commodus in 180 marked the descent from a kingdom of gold to one of rust and iron, a comment which has led some historians, notably Edward Gibbon, to take Commodus's reign as the beginning of the empire's decline. In 212, during the reign of Caracalla, Roman citizenship was granted to all freeborn inhabitants of the empire. The Severan dynasty was tumultuous. An emperor's reign was ended routinely by his murder or execution, and, following its collapse, the empire was engulfed by the crisis of the 3rd century, a period of invasions, civil strife, economic disorder, and plague. In defining historical epochs, this crisis sometimes marks the transition from classical to late antiquity. Aurelian, r. 270–275, stabilized the empire militarily, and Diocletian reorganized and restored much of it in 285. Diocletian's reign brought the empire's most concerted effort against the perceived threat of Christianity, the Great Persecution. Diocletian divided the empire into 4 regions, each ruled by a separate tetrarch. Confident that he fixed the disorder plaguing Rome, he abdicated along with his co-emperor, but the tetrarchy collapsed shortly after. Order was eventually restored by Constantine the Great, who became the first emperor to convert to Christianity, and who established Constantinople as the new capital of the Eastern Empire. During the decades of the Constantinian and Valentinian dynasties, the empire was divided along an east-west axis, with dual power centers in Constantinople and Rome. Julian, who under the influence of his advisor Mardonius attempted to restore classical Roman and Hellenistic religion, only briefly interrupted the succession of Christian emperors. Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule over both East and West, died in 395 after making Christianity the state religion. In historiography, the late or later Roman Empire, traditionally covering the period from 284 CE to 641 CE, was a time of significant transformation in Roman governance, society, and religion. Diocletian's reforms, including the establishment of the Tetrarchy, aimed to address the vastness of the empire and internal instability. The rise of Christianity, legalized by Constantine the Great in 313 CE, profoundly changed the religious landscape, becoming a central force in Roman life. Simultaneously, barbarian invasions, particularly by the Goths and the Huns, weakened the Western Roman Empire, which collapsed in 476 CE. In contrast, the Eastern Roman Empire endured, evolving into the Byzantine Empire and laying the foundations for medieval Europe. Fall of the Western Roman Empire. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, also called the fall of the Roman Empire or the fall of Rome, was the loss of central political control in the Western Roman Empire, a process in which the empire failed to enforce its rule, and its vast territory was divided among several successor polities. The Roman Empire lost the strengths that had allowed it to exercise effective control over its western provinces. Modern historians posit factors including the effectiveness and numbers of the army, the health and numbers of the Roman population, the strength of the economy, the competence of the emperors, the internal struggles for power, the religious changes of the period, and the efficiency of the civil administration. Increasing pressure from invading peoples outside Roman culture also contributed greatly to the collapse. Climatic changes and both endemic and epidemic disease drove many of these immediate factors. The reasons for the collapse are major subjects of the historiography of the ancient world, and they inform much modern discourse on state failure. In 376, a large migration of Goths and other non-Roman people, fleeing from the Huns, entered the empire. Roman forces were unable to exterminate, expel, or subjugate them, as was their normal practice. In 395, after winning 2 destructive civil wars, Theodosius I died. He left a collapsing field army, and the empire divided between the warring ministers of his 2 incapable sons. Goths and other non-Romans became a force that could challenge either part of the empire. Further barbarian groups crossed the Rhine and other frontiers. The armed forces of the Western Empire became few and ineffective, and despite brief recoveries under able leaders, central rule was never again effectively consolidated. By 476, the position of Western Roman emperor wielded negligible military, political, or financial power, and had no effective control over the scattered Western domains that could still be described as Roman. Barbarian kingdoms had established their own power in much of the area of the Western Empire. In 476, the Germanic barbarian king Odoacer deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire in Italy, Romulus Augustus, and the Senate sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno. Early Christianity. Early Christianity, otherwise called the Early Church or Paleo-Christianity, describes the historical era of the Christian religion up to the First Council of Nicaea in 325. Christianity spread from the Levant, across the Roman Empire, and beyond. Originally, this progression was closely connected to already established Jewish centers in the Holy Land and the Jewish diaspora throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The first followers of Christianity were Jews who had converted to the faith, i.e. Jewish Christians, as well as Phoenicians, i.e. Lebanese Christians. Early Christianity contains the Apostolic Age and is followed by and substantially overlaps with the Patristic era. The Apostolic Sees claim to have been founded by one or more of the apostles of Jesus, who are said to have dispersed from Jerusalem sometime after the crucifixion of Jesus, c. 2633, perhaps following the Great Commission. Early Christians gathered in small private homes known as house churches, but a city's whole Christian community would also be called a church. The Greek noun ecclesia, literally means assembly, gathering, or congregation, but is translated as church in most English translations of the New Testament. Many early Christians were merchants and others who had practical reasons for traveling to Asia Minor, Arabia, the Balkans, the Middle East, North Africa, and other regions. Over 40 such communities were established by the year 100, many in Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, such as the 7 churches of Asia. By the end of the 1st century, Christianity had already spread to Rome, Ethiopia, Alexandria, Armenia, Greece, and Syria, serving as foundations for the expansive spread of Christianity eventually throughout the world.